Think you know the greatest game of all time? Think again, because these classics have aged like fine milk. The early 3D era of gaming tends to be the worst victim of aging in the history of the medium. Early shooters have it especially rough, and GoldenEye 007 is a prime example. The 1997 game was a defining couch multiplayer game for a generation of players, and as recently as 2016, it was still being heralded by gaming publications as one of the best to ever exist. And while this may be the best James Bond video game, it isn't actually all that fun by today's standards. GoldenEye 007 may have been ahead of its time, but those controls don't feel good or natural anymore. The mission design has aged too. And for a game that was known for its multiplayer, it is surprisingly poorly balanced. You know what we mean. That fact makes for a bit of charming nostalgia, but it does not make GoldenEye a game worth revisiting. And now that the line between console and PC games isn't quite as thick as it used to be, fans tend to agree that, even at the time, GoldenEye was inferior to its PC contemporaries. Unless you're curious about the history of the franchise, Grand Theft Auto 3 isn't really worth playing these days. Even die-hard fans agree the early PS2 era of GTA doesn't quite hold up. Of course, the groundbreaking open world of GTA 3 changed the industry forever. But is being ahead of its time enough to justify playing through a 20-hour story? Obviously, open worlds have come a long way since GTA 3 in terms of both interactivity and fidelity. But it's unfair to compare this game to, say, Red Dead Redemption 2. That's no excuse, however, for how poorly the shooting and mission design has aged. The missions are simplistic and restrictive compared to modern sandbox games, especially those made by other studios. And then there's the writing. The mean-spirited satire of Grand Theft Auto was revolutionary for a time when games didn't have much to say. But was it ever good satire? Throw in a few iffy stereotypes, and you've got a game that's more likely to make you cringe than hoot with laughter. The crypt-crawling action-adventure series Tomb Raider has been one of the most influential franchises in gaming history. If you are going to start diving in now, though, you might not want to start at the very beginning. For one thing, the tank controls and platforming in 1996's Tomb Raider are unforgiving and incredibly demanding. Modern players used to the newer entries in the series are likely to find themselves constantly missing jumps and having to retry sections to the point of frustration. Unless you grew up playing this one, the gameplay is probably not gonna click. Don't worry too much though, this game has quite the legion of dedicated fans, and a number of mods and fixes have made the original PC version a lot more playable, so it's not totally impossible for you to enjoy a slice of gaming history. Speaking of Tomb Raider, who could forget its spiritual successor, Uncharted? These games attempted to capture the magic of Indiana Jones and largely succeeded in crafting a series of gorgeous, globe-trotting adventures.
Fortune and glory, kid. Fortune and glory.
The first Uncharted was an impressive PS3 launch game, and its sequel, Uncharted 2 Among Thieves, racked up Game of the Year awards like nobody's business. In retrospect, however, this is a flawed and uneven masterpiece. The presentational elements of Uncharted 2 still hold up, the voice acting is phenomenal, and the characters are well realized, if a bit shallow. Set-piece moments like the train sequence are still technically impressive a decade on, too. However, playing Uncharted 2 is a real slog. The over-reliance on combat and bullet-sponge enemies make for a frustrating time. The platforming is less involved than even the original Tomb Raider, and the game is linear and repetitive. Some players might find it worth going through to enjoy the story, but Uncharted 2 definitely doesn't hold up as a gold standard of gaming anymore. The original Metroid is an old game, so of course it doesn't totally hold up to modern standards. But that's not to say it's not worth mentioning. If you revisit the NES library, you'll find that many of the system's classics are still great. The Legend of Zelda and the original Super Mario hold up surprisingly well, for example. Even difficult games such as Castlevania and Mike Tyson's Punch-Out are still fun thanks to modern tools like Switch Online's Rewind feature. But Nintendo's early attempt at an open interconnected map is obtuse by today's standards. Play it today and you'll find Metroid to be directionless and almost indecipherable. While the ideas were obviously solid enough to become the foundation of an entire subgenre, the language of Metroidvanias had yet to be established in 1986. Nowadays, the game ranks low compared to the many incredible sequels it spawned. If you really want to go back to the beginning of the Metroid timeline, the excellent Zero Mission remake is a much better place to start. Arriving a year after Thief: The Dark Project and a year before Deus Ex, System Shock 2 was part of a wave of games that ushered immersive high-concept RPGs into popularity. The genre started to gain steam in the early 90s with the Ultima games, but the Thief and Shock series made huge strides in expanding the genre to a wider audience. Unfortunately, 1999's System Shock 2 hasn't quite held up. For one, System Shock 2 is a confusing tutorial segment up front that doesn't communicate the difference between classes or what the game is about in terms of exploration. This poor first impression is complemented by a game that drags in the story department, especially when the big twist only happens after about a third of the playtime. The original Max Payne was once heralded as an all-time great, taking the bullet time mechanic from The Matrix and mashing it up with a film noir story. The results has sadly not aged very well, especially if you're playing the PS2 port. How much the gameplay has aged depends on who you talk to. Mechanically, Max Payne is still a solid shooter that has plenty of defenders, but even they agree that the game's strength is not its story. Playing it on Xbox today, it's clear to see that Remedy's lead writer, Sam Lake, was still very much figuring out his style. For a studio now known for games such as Control and Alan Wake, this is bound to be pretty disappointing. The story walks the line between parody and cliché and often comes across as an overly edgy attempt to do something mature. Meanwhile, the comic-inspired cutscenes are full of misogynistic noir tropes, and the whole game is permeated with an uneven tone. Oh, and the two dream sequences where you have to carefully navigate invisible platforms, yeah, those are still the worst. Once a paragon of open-world design, Ubisoft Open World has now become shorthand for overwhelming map icons and tiring repetition. A major player that established this formula was Assassin's Creed 2, the sequel to the now maligned original historical fiction murder simulator. Without this game, the franchise wouldn't have gone on to be one of Ubisoft's biggest, its design seeping into all the company's other projects. Looking back, however, was this really a good thing? Many fans agree that AC2 hasn't quite aged like fine wine. The uninvolved combat and prevalence of finicky sneaking missions make it frustrating by today's standards. Additionally, the once-praised revenge story feels generic compared to, say, Assassin's Creed Origins. And sure, Ezio was once a gaming icon, but he and the other characters don't have a whole lot of depth or nuance. Let's not forget that a big chunk of the story was yanked out and turned into DLC, so the game could ship on time either. In retrospect, this was the beginning of a truly worrisome trend. Like Metroid, the original Resident Evil is a victim of a much more impressive remake. Still one of the best franchise's best games, 2002's retelling of the first Resident Evil story makes the original obsolete to anyone barring game historians and franchise completionists. In 1996, Resident Evil was a groundbreaking title that gave birth to a whole new genre. It also established the tank controls and fixed camera that would define this genre for the next decade and a half. But to many modern gamers, these same controls feel outdated. Some moments are still thrilling, but most of the scares don't work due to the dated visuals, and even tank control stands will admit the voice acting and translation of the script feel amateurish, despite grating us with such amazing lines as this.
That was too close. You were almost a Jill sandwich.
This is far from the worst in the series, of course, but if you're curious about Resident Evil, then it might be worth considering playing some of the newer entries first. Let's be clear, Fallout 3 is a pretty darn good game, but 2008 was a long time ago. This entry in Bethesda's iconic post-apocalyptic RPG series is no longer worthy of its place in the Hall of Fame for a few very specific reasons. For starters, going back to Fallout 3 means returning to the drab wasteland of the late 2000s, an era where it wasn't seen as such a problem for games to have a mostly grey palette. As a result, Fallout 3 is visually dull to say the least, and that dullness carries over to the game's shooting and storytelling. The side quests still stand out as some of the best in the genre, but the main storyline is unsatisfying and more or less acts as an excuse to explore the world. Nor does the game offer as many morally complex choices and branching paths as its successor, New Vegas. BioShock deserves much of the praise that has been heaped upon it. It has an astoundingly good opening hour, and Rapture still oozes atmosphere, making it one of the most exciting destinations in all of gaming. However, people tend to forget that the original BioShock is also overly long and falls apart completely by the end of its runtime. You can trace the whole "our game's art" discourse back to the ambitious release of BioShock in 2007, but truthfully, the story doesn't hold up. The big twist 2/3 of the way through the game was mighty impressive for the time, but it won't exactly blow your mind today. And it doesn't help that the final third builds to a disappointing boss fight, all while doubling down on the clunky combat and a weird emphasis on scrounging through every trash can for healing items and ammo. Yes, BioShock is a masterwork of atmosphere and environmental storytelling, but this overly long and mechanically unsatisfying shooter has aged incredibly poorly. You might call it a masterpiece or even just the best Zelda game of all time, but time has been less forgiving to Ocarina of Time. Need proof? Go hook up your N64 and give that controller to someone who plays games today and tell them to go wild. They won't last an hour. The truth is that Ocarina of Time was a revolutionary game for its era, and is still very much worth playing for that reason. After all, this game set the template for the next 25 years of action-adventure games. But that is the primary reason it doesn't hold up as one of the best games of all time. From its early attempts at a pseudo-open world to the infamous Z-targeting combat, the elements of Ocarina that defined its place in history have been copied and perfected in the decades since. Most of the dungeon design holds up, aside from the water temple and some other clunky spots, but the camera, especially in the original release, is a relic of a different age. Critically acclaimed modern masterpieces such as God of War and Dark Souls owe a lot to the first 3D Zelda. But our advice? Just play those games instead. Today, rankings of the series commonly place Breath of the Wild, A Link to the Past, and even Majora's Mask above this N64 classic. And they're right to do so.